It's March 12, 1913, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
It was today in history in 1913 that a small group of dignitaries gathered in a remote spot in rural New South Wales to announce that the capital city of the new federated nation of Australia would be not Sydney, not Melbourne, but right here, a former sheep station known by the local farmers as Canberra.
Yeah, well, the location had actually already been decided through quite a complicated process we'll get to in a minute, but it was the naming that happened today. There had been much debate in Parliament and nominations for what Australia's new capital could be called. Austral was one, which does sound a bit like nostrils, Hopetown and Myola, but the winning name, with 18 votes, was Canberra, which was actually interestingly chosen because of its Aboriginal roots, the name meaning roughly meeting place.
Yeah, and actually, of those alternative names that Canberra wasn't called, I heard a bit about Myola. The future Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, on hearing this name was so unimpressed, he said, "Sounds like the last despairing cry of an Italian prostitute," which I thought was hilarious. Anyway, it wasn't that one that they chose. It was Canberra. And the whole federation, I mean, we need to get back to what an entirely weird place Canberra is, largely because of a lot of the planning decisions that were made in its very early stages. But coming back to why Australia federated in the first place, which happened in 1901, it's basically because the 6 British colonies realised that this was a ridiculous thing to still be doing, holding out as 6 distinct places: New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland, Western Australia and Tasmania. And they all decided to come together basically because they were like, well, look, we're economically competing with each other and that's ridiculous. We have like rail gauges that are not the same because we're all making our railways to different specifications. We literally have tariffs on one another's goods coming across borders. They were weak militarily. And also, increasingly, people just saw themselves as Australians. Australians had competed together in a very famous Ashes series in the late 1800s, and they were starting to write literature that was Australian in its character and its tone. And so there was this sense that we can come together as a people and have our own country, and we, in doing that, we need our own capital. And so then there was quite a lot of debate, particularly because there were these 2 mega power centres of Sydney and Melbourne. And so that's how they settled on this particular location.
It was these competing claims of Sydney and Melbourne that prompted the idea of a third option. Sydney had had no challenges for decades. It was the centre of governance and culture and everything.
And remains the place that everyone in the world names when you say what's in Australia.
Yeah, I think so. But, if you had this debate 50 years before, Sydney would have had no contenders, but because of the gold rush in Victoria, Melbourne had had this stratospheric growth, kind of what, when we talked about the California gold rush, what it did for San Francisco, the Australian gold rush did for Melbourne. So there was now this rivalry. So it was very carefully calibrated not to upset anybody too much. The capital would have to be a brand new city, and there was actually a specific stipulation that it could not be less than 100 miles from Sydney. The Melbournians had their eyes out. They knew what the Sydney-siders would be up to.
No commuting.
Yes, quite. The first choice was the small settlement of Dalgety, but New South Wales' state government refused to sell it to the federal government. But eventually it was decided that the simplest, safest choice was an existing area with an existing name. It was named Canberra, after the name of the local indigenous people, by Joshua John Moore, who was the first European landowner in the area in the 1820s. He'd called his tract Canberra initially, but by the 1850s, people were starting to say Canberra. The name was announced by the Governor-General's wife, Lady Gertrude Denman, and she said, "I named the capital of Australia Canberra," and then she added, presumably because most people would be reading this in the papers, the accent is on the can. So they knew this was a place that would not be familiar to most Australians, never mind to most people from around the world.
Maybe all of this background accounts for why Canberra still has a reputation, frankly, as a rather dull place. And I wonder if that's, got its roots right the way back in this fudge, this compromise. Choosing a place because of its neutrality doesn't bode well for a city that people are going to really bond with. I mean, even the fact that it had to be inland as well, that was another thing that was one of the stipulations when they were trying to find a location. they decided that it shouldn't be on the sea because we're in 1913 and they want to defend Parliament from attacks from the sea. But I mean, by definition, in such a large country where the vast majority of people live on the coast, it actually makes it quite marooned from everyone's lives. It's a strange place. I've never been, Arian. I imagine you were dragged there on numerous school trips.
We definitely. And it's as peculiar as you would imagine, entirely from exactly the things that you're saying. Like it is this little town. They came to the business of designing it by opening up a big international competition. They got in 137 entries from 15 different nations. And then the winning person was this American architect, Walter Burley Griffin. And his design philosophy was to make it all about circles. And so the reality of going there, both as a kid and now, is that it's this land of roundabouts. And you can understand it as a design philosophy, being this sort of focal point, and you have Parliament, it's the centre, and everything then is concentrically arranged around it. And it's sort of...
Which, by the way, they did in Washington, D.C. as well. But I guess the difference is because of, like I'm saying, because the distance involved. Canberra's just a one-company town. There's nothing else
exactly,
there.
Yeah. And also, even once you are there, that other central design philosophy that they were working with, which was that it should be harmonious with nature, it just leaves you in this town that is both monumental in scale. It's got huge boulevards that are almost like Washington, D.C. or communist scale, with these massive parliament here and huge museum there. But then, also nice little lake walk, and no one's there. Like, it's got this tiny population.
You can see how this seemed like such a perfect idea. Like, they were kind of these young American architects. They were influenced by all these new styles. It was going to be this geometric, human-friendly city of the future. But as you say, it came down to the geography. The initial compromise, not only... Canberra's strange because not only is it kind of remote in the sense that it's removed from those major population centres, but also it's quite close to them comparatively for Australia, which means if you're a business owner or a cultural institution or a sports stadium or a university or an airport, you're not going to move to Canberra if you're already in Sydney or Melbourne. So while Canberra does have all these things, obviously it has plenty of its own things, it's always been in Sydney and Melbourne shadow because in a way it's almost too close to them to have convinced people to move. Even the federal government, most civil service departments didn't move to Canberra until the 1950s, and the High Court managed to stay in Melbourne until 1980.
Yeah, well, to be fair, there were two wars between this naming ceremony and Canberra kind of booming. Australia was otherwise engaged. I think they did have their priorities right. But when you look at why they chose this submission, it does remind me, Arian, of when we were discussing the Sydney Opera House. It's a similar thing. You had the competition, didn't you, with people all around the world trying to chip in. But also then when you're choosing, you're thinking, what does this bold nation that we're creating, what represents it? And the answer is, I'm not entirely confident, so we're going to nick stuff from other places in the world. We're going to get some American architects using some British ideas and some Japanese calligraphy kind of to create an Australian identity. It's like we're hedging our bets a bit.
Yeah, which does tie into at least, quite a lot of people's sense of what Australian identity is. We are this sort of mishmash melting pot, I think many people think, when we're at our best. And so maybe bringing all of those good ideas from around the world is not a bad starting point. But I think... when design is allowed to be your priority over organic expansion or just that sort of natural way that cities come together, then I think you can end up in peculiar sort of it always feels like it's an artificial construct.
Yeah, I mean, it's been more than a century since the day that we're talking about, and Canberra still has less than 500,000 residents, and Sydney and Melbourne have more than 5 million each. Growth was very slow, as you mentioned, Ollie. The First World War and the Second World War and the Depression in between didn't really do a lot to stimulate growth. But another factor as well is that the city was teetotal at its foundation, had an alcohol ban until 1927. This was because of King O'Malley, who was the Home Affairs Minister. He was actually at this naming ceremony. He was a teetotaler, and he insisted on a total ban on the issuing of licenses to sell alcohol that lasted for 14 years. And in classic Australian style, there is a pub in downtown Canberra called King O'Malley's.
That's good. Well, there are a couple of oddities about Canberra, nonetheless. Tent City, erected by Aborigines in 1972, remains one of the world's longest continuous protests. And sex work was legalised there in 1992 in a complete about-face to the Prohibition era you were just describing. There were actually this mushrooming of brothels in the completely unsexy-sounding suburb of Fyshwick.
Can they get anything right?
At least call it Hot Town. You can name it whatever you want.
Tomorrow.
Live sacrifice, ripping the heart out, the whole shebang.
But they had a couple of copies of the New Testament.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.